We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time.
Good morning, greetings, and a warm welcome to the Center of Global Development event on a new book on how civil society influences tax policy. We have a very distinguished panel today to delve into a subject which is important both domestically within the countries and on the international stage. I see 4 compelling reasons why this topic demands our attention. First, substantial investments are needed in developing countries as we strive to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and address the climate crisis. A report prepared for the G20 last year underscored that a large proportion of needed resources, that is 2/3 of the total, must be mobilized domestically, with the remainder sourced externally. Separately, some years back, the IMF had estimated that low-income developing countries on average would need to raise an additional 5% of GDP in revenues domestically to fund the key SDGs. This estimate is higher now due to the scarring of these economies from the COVID-19 pandemic and other crises. Secondly, the anticipated external resource flows are not materializing, leading countries to increasingly rely on internal resources. For example, last year, we saw negative net inflows into developing countries once debt obligations were factored in. Thirdly, despite progress in boosting domestic tax collections since 1990, low-income developing countries and emerging market economies have witnessed stagnation in the tax to GDP ratios since 2012. This stagnation poses a significant challenge to financing the SDGs and facilitating a transition to a more sustainable climate agenda. Consequently, there is a pressing need to enhance the design of the tax systems and strengthen institutions to unlock the full revenue potential estimated by the IMF to be at 9% of GDP on average. Finally, debt burdens have risen in low-income countries since COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine. As a result, these countries are using an increasing share of their revenues to cover interest obligations on domestic and foreign debt. A significant proportion of the revenues is now allocated to servicing interest obligations, surpassing 1/3 of tax revenues in many countries. This has squeezed spending on education, health, and infrastructure. Because of their precarious fiscal position, these countries would most likely need to embark on fiscal consolidation to bring their debt loads to sustainable levels. But then cutting spending and increasing tax revenues has implications for the poor and income inequality. Against this background, we gather today to explore the insights offered by a new book examining the influence of civil actors on tax policy. The book delves into civil society-led tax reform campaigns across 7 countries. To kick off our discussion, Paulo Di Renzio, who is the editor of the book, will make a short presentation. He is a senior lecturer at the Brazilian School of Public and Business Administration, with a visiting faculty position at the London School of Economics. Paulo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanjeev, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Let me tell you quickly something about the background to this book, which we're discussing today. A few years ago, I was still working with the International Budget Partnership, an NGO, international NGO that works on public finance-related issues, strengthening the role of civil society in analyzing, monitoring, and advocating for different budget policies at the country level. And we had just started what is now called the Tax Equity Initiative. So a new initiative looking at the revenue side of the budget, working with civil society groups, trying to get them involved in influencing tax policies at the country level. So the first thing we did at the time was look around and we asked ourselves, what are some interesting cases where we see civil society, civic actors, civil society-led campaigns that are aimed at making tax systems more equitable or stopping them from becoming more inequitable. And we quickly realized that there weren't that many cases out there that we could document and that we could look into, partly because civil society historically has not had a big role in tax policy. Tax policy is usually something that is decided within closed government circles, maybe with the lobbying from business, etc., but something that is not often carried out in a very transparent and open manner. So we documented 7 of these case studies from 7 different countries, as Sanjeev said, and I'll give you a quick flavor of each one of them before I focus actually most of my presentation on some of the emerging themes from these 7 case studies, some of the lessons that we think might be relevant for other civil society actors interested in engaging with this topic, but also for governments and donors as well. So there's 7 of these cases. I'm going to list them in alphabetical order. The first one is the Yellow Vests in France, which made many headlines around 2018, 2019. And this was a big protest movement, very spontaneous, of people reacting against the Macron government, who had introduced higher taxes on fossil fuels. We had a case in Guatemala of an organization called ICEFI, the Central American Institute for Fiscal Studies, that after a big corruption scandal in 2015, put forward the proposal to completely reform the tax administration agency and make it more transparent and more accountable. We have the case of the Tax Justice Network Africa in Kenya that took the Kenyan government to court, trying to invalidate a recently negotiated double taxation treaty with Mauritius, using the argument that it had not followed due procedure, but also that it would result in substantive revenue shortfalls for the government. We looked at a case in Mexico of a human rights organization called Fundar that basically, again, took the government to court to make the names of the beneficiaries of repeated tax amnesties. Basically, the government used to pardon tax debts for a number of people and organizations and corporations worth a lot of money. Nobody knew where that money was going. So Fundar basically made the government publish that information. And they also found out that these were very regressive. They were benefiting people and corporations that didn't really need that additional money. We have a case from the Philippines of an organization called Action for Economic Reforms that pushed the government to raise sin taxes, so-called sin taxes on alcohol and tobacco consumption, to finance universal health coverage. We have a case in Uganda of an organization called Seatini that reacted to the government introducing very regressive taxes on mobile money transfers using cell phones and on the use of social media. And finally, we have, it's actually 3 cases in one from the US, 3 different states, Maine, Massachusetts, and Minnesota, that try to introduce increased taxes on the income of wealthy and rich individuals to finance basic services, in most cases, education and other similar things. So it's quite a varied group of cases that look at different countries, different types of taxes, different kinds of campaigns, and different types of organizations leading them. What were some of the, let's say, key lessons emerging from these case studies? And there's 5 themes that we document in the book. The first one is about the need for civic actors to basically be able to craft a very convincing narrative around the need to make tax systems more equitable. There's 3 main narratives that come up. One is around the idea and different ways of frame tax justice, so taxation and the progressiveness of taxation being something that should be promoted or defended in the name of fairness, in the name of justice. But also the second narrative was about earmarking resources from taxation for specific development priorities like basic services and so on. And the third narrative was around transparency and accountability in tax administration as ways not only to avoid corruption, but also to promote equity and understand the distributional impact of tax policy. Clearly, crafting a good story is important, but it's not enough. So there's a lot that we look at in the book about different messaging strategies, the use of the media, so how to basically reach out to different audiences and bring them on board and convince them of the need for the tax policies that these organizations were advocating for. The second lesson is about strategies, or let's say a combination of strategies that are more likely to lead to impact, and the fact that organizations need to engage with using very different entry points, working directly with the executive, working with maybe oversight institutions, working through the media, building civil society coalitions, putting pressure on government, both from the inside and from the outside. So the more organizations that we documented use the combination of insider and outsider strategies, the more effective their campaigns seemed to become. Linked to this is the issue of coalitions and the need to build effective reform coalitions, bringing together a diverse set of actors, using common interests as the glue basically of reform coalitions, sometimes bringing in unexpected allies like religious groups, for example, in the US, or parts of the business community that were negatively affected by some of the tax reforms that were being introduced. So really being creative in bringing people together and being able to overcome opposition to the reform. Fourth emerging theme is about capacity. And we say it 3 times because we basically see that there's 3 different types of capacity that are needed for successful campaigns. Often technical capacity is the one that gets talked about mostly, and the fact that civil society actors need to step up their skills, their analytical skills, their capacity to analyze and argue, with an evidence base in favor or against certain reforms. But there's other capacities that are just as crucial. So political capacity to create coalitions, to influence governments, to bring people together, etc. And communications capacity, which links back to the issue of narratives and the capacity of civic actors to tell a good story, convince others, craft the narrative, make sure that they are able to control, let's say, how people interpret what is going on. And fifth and last is the issue of political opportunities. So in many cases, either elections and changes of government, corruption scandals, other types of let's say, shocks or external events create windows of opportunity for reform. And what we see is the crucial need for civic actors to be able to exploit those political opportunities when they present themselves. So actually using, the many years when maybe nothing much is happening and not many opportunities for reform exist, to do the technical work, to prepare the coalitions, to lay the ground basically, so that when a political opportunity arises, they are ready to hit the ground running. In Guatemala, we see this very clearly, in Mexico, and in some of the other cases as well. So these 5 emerging themes were basically the key, let's say, takeaways that we focus on in the book. Just to conclude, some key lessons for civic actors, it's quite obvious. For each one of the 5 emerging themes, There's rich materials to draw on that can help the civic actors across the world to craft more effective tax campaigns. They have a menu of options that they can draw on to think about how they want to set up their own campaign and so on. For government actors, and more specifically for reformers within government, I think it's important to recognize that civic actors can be important partners in tax reform processes. They can provide technical analyses, they can apply political pressure from the outside, they can help coordinate reform coalition, broker different kinds of alliances and so on. And this role that they can play often goes unrecognized and unexploited. And finally, for donors, I guess the key point that we want to highlight is that they need to understand that civil society tax advocacy is really a long-term endeavor that requires flexible support. And this may sound, not particularly new or groundbreaking, but is something that keeps coming up and that is still quite difficult for donors to respond to adequately. So what we see in many cases is 5-10 years of background work that is necessary to finally be able to see some impact. So that's pretty much the summary of what the book is about. Thanks to the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that basically supported the project, we were also able to provide the book as open access. So if you click on the link that was in the original invite for this seminar and you scroll down the page on the Bloomsbury academic website, you'll find the link to the open access PDF. Thank you, Sanjeev.
The stage for our discussion. We have three panelists, in addition to Paolo, who will join the conversation. Let me first introduce our panelists. Chiara Bronchi is currently Global Practice Manager at the World Bank. Prior to the bank, she worked at the ADB, IMF, and the OECD. So she has covered all the major international institutions. Nabil Ahmed leads Oxfam's agenda on economic justice. He was a lead author of Oxfam's flagship Global Inequality Report in 2022, Inequality Kills. Deirdre Elemayu is Executive Coordinator of Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Prior to this position, he worked for the Christian Aid. Before proceeding further, I would like to make a short announcement for the audience. They can submit their questions through Twitter at CGDev, hashtag CGDTalks, or email at events@cgdev.org or on YouTube. These questions will be available to us to be seen on our screen. To allow us to go through about 3 rounds of questions, so may I please request the panelists to be precise and short. Let me start with Nabil. Oxfam and you have been proactive in global campaigns, addressing issues such as personal income and wealth inequality. How can taxation serve as a tool to mitigate inequality? And what role do civil actors play in advancing this cause? Nabil.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. Thank you so much, Paolo. I've read your book, and even just listening to you now was very refreshing, and I really appreciate the effort that's gone into all of this, and it's our pleasure to be here as Oxfam. Look, Sanjeev, it's an excellent question, and for me, the starting point is just to take a step back, right, and to recognize that we do live in a moment of extraordinary inequality of income and wealth concentration. It would be remiss of me as an Oxfam person to not even headline with some of these things. So, we know, for example, how just this decade, the top 5 billionaires of the world, their wealth has increased by over $800 billion since 2020. Billionaire wealth itself has doubled over the last decade. That's just about 2,500 people. The wealth gap between the 0.01% of the world and the bottom half of the world has increased by 50% since the global financial crash. And we're in a place where the 1% of the world own more than 95% of the world combined. And at the same time, what's happening to the bottom? The wealth of the bottom 60% is down this decade. In fact, the nearly bottom 50% of the world, that's nearly 4 billion people, they own less than 1% of global wealth. And we can go into some of these figures about how global income inequality actually declined over many decades, primarily due to rising incomes in China, for example, but it's gone back up since 2020. At the same time, inequality between countries has increased for the first time, and within most countries has too. For us, it's really important to express, when we're talking about this, that the spectacular rise of wealth and income at the very top has not just coincided, but has been fueled by a war on taxes by and for the richest 1%. And what's remarkable, actually, and you can break this down, if you look at the top personal income tax marginal rates, you can look at taxes on dividend incomes, you look at tax on the top rates of inheritance, corporate income tax, all of these remarkably collapse in country after country around the world. And the top rates of tax on income, if you just to focus on that one, they've become lower and less progressive, with the average tax rate on the richest falling from about 58% in 1980 to around 40% more recently. That's just in the OECD countries. And if you're looking at over 100 countries, it's about 31%. At the same time, for every dollar raised in tax in the world today, only 4 cents of every dollar is coming from taxes on wealth. In fact, 2/3 of all countries do not have any form of inheritance tax on wealth and assets passed to direct descendants. For us, there's two primary things going on here when we're thinking about the inequality dimension. The one is all of this is enabling a concentration of wealth and income at the very top. And if I was to give a very specific example, just think about how the start of this decade, trillions of dollars rightly were injected into financial markets, into economies to avert their collapse. And this fresh cash, let's be clear, it was essential to keeping economies afloat, to keeping people afloat. And yet so much of that ended up with the ultra wealthy who were able to ride a stock market surge. And a massive reason for that was that the guardrails of progressive taxation did simply not exist to be able to share that wealth more equitably. 2/3 of all new wealth this decade, at the start of this decade, actually went to the top 1%. We can also just see from the corporate profits boom, we've seen record profits after decades in many countries, including here in the US. So much of that has been pocketed by those at the very top. Again, taxation goes to the heart of this issue. To the extent that the very richest, for about 100 of the world's largest corporations, have received about 82 of every $100 of corporate profits through dividends and buybacks. For me, this is the first part. The other part of the inequality piece is, yes, emphasis goes into tax as redistribution, but even if you didn't spend a cent or rupee on redistribution, progressive taxation has an immediate impact on how income and wealth is shared in our economy. And that's why I wanted to focus there. But the second piece is the downstream impact in undermining countries' ability to raise revenues to then invest in essential public goods. And I would add that this doesn't just reduce the scope of investment in our economy, but also reduces the scope for imagination, for the way that we can invest in human capabilities. So that's the second piece on the inequality piece. So the first part is enabling a concentration of wealth and income at the very top. The collapse in taxation has enabled that. But the second piece is the investment scope. I want to end just with a couple of points as well, is to say that for us, it's so important to expand the case here. Taxation, for example, as we've understood through history, as a tool to protect our democracies from oligarchy. And now a new case that many of us are making as well, that progressive taxation as a tool to tackle the climate crisis. We know, for example, and our own data shows how emissions of the 1% at the very top are more than 66% of humanity. Some excellent research done by the World Bank to show, for example, that if inequality was reduced, the amount of carbon emissions required to eradicate extreme poverty would be 1/3 of what it is with current levels of inequality. And according to Oxfam's calculation, we can go a step deeper here to say that a tax of 60% on the income of the top 1% would actually reduce global emissions by 700 million tons. So it's not just about the investments that we're able to make, although that's absolutely vital from progressive taxation into tackling the climate crisis, but it's also direct impact on reducing emissions. And I'll cap by saying this is, to the final part of your question, tax groups have had such an essential role, especially if you look at recent years and just past decades, and you look at the examples from your excellent book, time and time again, they're almost the last line of defense in this war against progressive taxation. They're the ones holding governments to account, local, national, sub-regional, regional levels. They track spending, they pressure, they shine a light in darkness. They also help shift the imagination of what's possible. I want to be clear here that it's civic actors more broadly as well, tax groups, but also so many other groups who are fighting for tax justice. And sometimes we need to remember that role as well. Look at the role of journalists and civil society in the Panama Papers. Look at the groups of experts like ICRICT, the international level. Civic actors, are organizations on tax justice, but also on climate, on debt. Especially when these groups come together, they truly make an impact. My very final line, Sanjeev, and you've been very kind to let me speak here, is there are civic actors who have been pushing for progressive taxation, but let's also remember the civic actors in the other way. We should not forget that there's a whole lot of very well-funded civic actors still pushing the other way that also needs to be part of our equation in how we address this question. But I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. Let me now turn to Deirdre. Deirdre, you've been focusing on international taxation. What obstacles have you encountered in shaping this taxation policies at the national and international levels? And which countries, whether advanced or developing, have shown receptivity to your advocacy?
Thank you very much for the question. I wanted to start with a broader comment about the book. Actually, it is a good summary of my own personal experience. I was the founding chair of TGNA. I know how things developed and how one of the achievements of TGNA was really to make tax treaties a public and a policy issue at the parliament level, at the national level. To come to the point, also from what Nabil also described, let us ask ourselves, things were not as bad as they are today in terms of progressive taxation or the taxation of the rich. In the 60s, in the 70s, if you look at Western Europe, if you look at even at the US, the tax system was not like this. There was a fundamental shift that happened beginning in the 80s, and then it became a worldwide phenomenon. So to come back to the question, so what I'm saying is we have to also see why did this change? Actually the demands we are putting today is more or less to go back to the 60s and 70s to make taxes progressive. If you look at Western Europe, for example, the tax GDP ratio has more or less remained the same. But if you look at the share of tax from corporate income tax and the share of tax from labor, you see that the tax on the corporations have come down, the tax on labor has gone up. That is why the total sum has remained unchanged. So there is a big political shift and policy shift, which is the political context in which tax reform demands both internationally and nationally are taking place. So I will start with the first hurdle in campaigning for international reform of international tax rules. The first is really the perception and the narrative which was prevalent when we started the tax justice campaign. For example, studies started coming out looking at the debt and debt service and debt repayment flows, looking at different international transactions, that developing countries are losing more resources than they get in the form of FDI and development aid as well. So when we started the campaign against illicit financial flows, not only from outside the continent in Africa, the widely believed fact, the widely believed perception was that if Africa gets more money from outside than it loses in any form, and B, for the loss itself, it is the local corrupt leaders which are the principal and the main actors doing that. So to show that Africa is a net exporter of capital to the rest of the world was a precondition for us to mobilize the campaign against illicit financial flows. So what I want to say by this is the perception had to be changed to show that the flow of resources in the contemporary economic system is from the poor to the rich. So, but without changing this perception, it is not possible to mobilize civil society. It is not possible to enter into a discourse and a dialogue with government. So overcoming perceptions was the first obstacle that has to be taken. The second challenge for us was really that the international economic order, the governance system, is oligarchic. The rich countries dominate the structure and the decision and standard setting mechanisms. They want to keep it there. So all our fight in the last 10, 15 years was to bring international tax rulemaking and standard setting back to the UN where it belongs, because the current ones were formulated by the League of Nations, which was the precursor of the UN. But this has been systematically blocked by the OECD, by the major OECD countries. To give you an example, at the Financing for Development third conference, which took place in Addis in 2015, there was a demand of the G77 plus China, the negotiating group in the UN of developing countries, which demanded the creation of an international, a UN tax body to look at the standard setting and rulemaking. Actually, the rich OECD countries said, if this paragraph is in the outcome document, we are not going to participate in the negotiations. So they practically blackmailed the whole conference. The G77 plus China countries were put under pressure by Ethiopia, which was hosting the conference, to pull out this phrase, this paragraph, asking for a UN tax body. When it was finally taken out, the G77 plus China came out with a statement saying, we have taken it out from this outcome document now, but we'll continue our fight for a rulemaking and standard setting process at the UN. So the basic difficulty for us, or the challenge, was to change the relation of forces which was established. For example, the current rules were done when most African countries were not even independent, when they were colonies. The distribution of taxing rights is not equal. For this reason, we were asking for a universal organization with equal membership, in which countries can, as independent countries, negotiate on international tax cooperation. But this was a hard fight on the side of the OECD to block this process from coming to the United Nations. And the OECD started a process which is, I cannot go into detail, which was biased against the interests of developing countries. I can give you many examples in that, which did not touch upon the fundamentals of the problem, which was only a marginal patchwork just to keep the process under the OECD system. And above all, it has not even got the support of its own member countries. The US, for example, although they say the OECD should make it, are no signatory to the minimum standards which the OECD claims to have resolved after 12 years of negotiations. So the power imbalance international economic order is one of the biggest challenges. But what is changing now, through also civil society struggle, is that developing countries are more and more coming together to challenge the domination, to look at the international tax system as one of the reasons for the perverse flow of resources in the world, and to claim their right of a share from international global profit of multinational companies. So it is not by accident that Africa Group has become the lead in this process at the UN, because they knew that they were not getting anything from the OECD process in terms of revenue from illicit by stopping illicit financial flows, or by minimizing tax dodging happening in the continent. So the coalition of the Africa Group with the broader G77 constellation has made it possible to bring this issue to the United Nations for the first time, for the United Nations General Assembly to agree on a intergovernmental negotiations process, and the outcome of it will be then a framework tax convention, which we hope will be anchored in the principles of human rights, the right development as a framing context, and in which also taxing rights will be distributed fairly by following standards which are accepted by a coalition of member states of the United Nations. So just to summarize, the problem of international tax and domestic taxation is perception issues are very important. The second is the big shift that has happened at the beginning of the 1980s, and which has really influenced policy making in most countries, and also promoted by the IFI, is a big factor, a big challenge, because you cannot just separate tax out of other economic policy measures.
Yes. Sound is gone.
Sorry, I don't know. Anyway, the prevalent economic and political structure globally, in how the global economy is governed, and the underlying ideological infrastructure is a big challenge. That is why my idea with that is, for mobilization, we have to look at the whole context to make a meaningful public mobilization possible. You cannot take out just tax and mobilize for it. The whole power structure globally and internationally should be taken into consideration. And my final remark is, let us try to understand why things changed. Why were things better in the 60s and the 80s in terms of tax policy, in terms of economic policy? Why was shared prosperity possible then? Why did it become difficult? And why was it reversed since the 1980s? This is a fundamental question which should not be bracketed out. That is the biggest challenge. If you do, and in these policy terms, sometimes when you discuss some tax policy reforms in Africa, you see that some are more Catholic than the priest. And these are really the real challenges that we are facing. So the ideological structure, the power structure, is a big challenge. For civil society to build alliances and coalitions to reverse this, only the tax justice movement cannot do. It is the whole society that should question the situation, how things are evolving in economic terms, in social terms, and in terms of also sharing prosperity. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dredge. We'll come back to the issue of political structure and how civil society can influence the political decision making to get the right kind of tax policy outcomes. Let me turn to Jera. You have been at the bank, and the bank, of course, does lending and also provides advisory services. In that context, of course, the issues of taxation come up, and so the one thing that we would like to know is how successful has been your collaboration civil society in getting some positive outcomes for member countries?
Thank you, Sanjeev, and for inviting me, and also thanks, Paolo, because it was reading your book was a delight, and it also resonates with the experience at the World Bank, but also with the other international financial institutions. Maybe one point I wanted to say is that the World Bank does have a lot of mechanisms for at least consulting with civil society organizations. At the high level, in terms of country partnership framework, when we engage every 4 years, we agree with the government on a set of lending proposals, but also assistance in various dimensions, not only taxation. But we also engage at project level. When I say project level, as Sanjeev, you mentioned, is when we say do a public financial management policy lending, or a fiscal stability policy lending, and many other dimensions. We normally tend to consult with civil society, and in some cases, these operations are all have analytical underpinnings. Forgive me the jargon. It means that before engaging into a lending operation, we also do a lot of analytical work. And that analytical work in some countries, we do it with actually think tanks, research institutes that are based in the country. And also we engage with, if it's about taxation, with the private sector, or with some specific research groups that have the capacity to help us understanding that. We also, in the analytical side, we do public financial reviews, and that will look at the tax revenue per GDP and the performance, as well as how the funds are being spent. And that would also require discussion with the government, but also making it public, and also public consumption and consulting with a range of stakeholders in the country. I'm just focusing right now on the domestic side of revenue mobilization, but public financial management more broadly. The international side, I think we heard about. So I think it's important that I tell you a bit more on the engagement at the domestic level, and I'll also tell you why. Let me finish on the instruments. Just to give you another example, we do medium-term revenue strategies together also with our colleagues at the IMF. And as that is also another analytical assessment that then leads to recommendations that would enter in an IMF program as well as in a World Bank program. And that is also, there is a window where we have to consult with civil society. So then the examples are several of, and I cannot give you a lot of countries specifically because of also confidentiality or reservation, but I can tell you that my experience in, for example, in Tanzania, where I was based for 4.5 years, a few years back, through this instrument, through the dialogue, through also the analysis, we were able to engage with think tanks that had the capacity, that's important, what Paolo mentioned at the very beginning, to follow this tax dialogue, and also to make it, then to talk to the people, to talk to the citizens, to engage with media. And media are of different types. It's broadcasting media, but it's radio, but it's also social media. So talking through groups, and it goes from national level, subnational level, all the way to the wards or to small local communities where you have a chief of the village that explains why that reform is important. The experience on these engagements is, and I think Paolo's book is quite nice, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, is that when we engage with civil society, it needs to resonate with them. And often in low-income countries or low-middle-income countries, what resonates is more the spending side, not so much the revenue side. And so it's very important to understand that raising revenues will help the country maybe to allocate more resources to social services, and how those social services are being delivered down to the local community. So what I'm trying to say here is that we're more impactful when we can show the whole delivery chain of why raising revenues, why raising domestic, because this is taxation really, and to do tax and have people contributing based also on their ability to contribute is important for service delivery. But we also need to talk about the credibility of the budget process. What we know is that in low income countries, often the budget process is extremely weak. And so raising revenues will not necessarily go or assure that their resources will go to the services. And that's important to maintain that chain. That's why I was talking about fiscal policies, public financial management policies, which would include also domestic revenue mobilization reforms. I want to give you an example that I think it's in another area, but where I found that we were particularly, at least it was a learning experience for me. In another reform that was requested by a country in sub-Saharan Africa, that was about helping them to establish service, to strengthen their ability to provide administrative services to citizens. The government was asking to issue, to help them to better issue passports, business permits. And I have to be honest, I was a bit skeptical at the beginning of that reform, and I wasn't certain. I was leading that operation actually from the bank side. I was concerned that that was not a good match of what citizens really wanted, certainly in urban areas, and what the government thought was a priority. And I actually, through engaging with civil society and also focus groups on this type of reform, I was proven wrong. And so wrong in the sense that actually that was really part of the demand or request of citizens. And so that was another way for us to give, certainly to motivate, also to give stronger reasoning for the bank to be supporting in this reform, because it was really a match. On tax is much more difficult to do that. Because indeed it's not impacting citizens directly. So they will sometimes feel the pain of having to pay more taxes. And in low income countries in particular, it would be primarily indirect taxation that would be easier to collect than direct taxes, or corporate income tax or personal income tax are pretty low still in percentage of GDP and also in percentage of total revenue collected. So if you need to go fast, you would probably, a government or Ministry of Finance would look at indirect taxation. And that's where it becomes a sour point. And I think there's very good examples in Paolo's book. But otherwise, is the direct link between progressive tax system or a corporate income tax is not so visible at the local level. So you really need to have brokers of information and also capacity, and this would be the more sophisticated civil society organization or think tanks that can really help also the bank to explain what is the purpose of that reform. Let me stop here. I hope I gave you an overview. Over.
Thank you, Chiara. This is very helpful because linking service delivery to taxation is important. And in fact, the quality of services has an impact on tax compliance. So people will pay taxes only if they're receiving good quality services. So it's important to link taxation with service delivery, and I think you did it very nicely, and also linked it to the budget process. Nabil, let me come back to you. Sorry, let me go to Paolo since we haven't involved him in the discussion. I mean, I looked through your book and I um, read the examples and the case studies. So the question that came to my mind, and I couldn't get that information, perhaps you can give us that. Did these interactions between CSOs and national authorities contribute to increased revenue mobilization in the 5 developing country case studies? Did it make any difference, or it only improved the quality of decision making?
So I would say the initial, let's say the main focus of the effort in documenting these case studies was, let's say, the equity impact, so the distributional impact of tax policy. So the main focus was not on increasing revenue levels or improving domestic revenue mobilization indicators. At the same time, and we do see there is at least a couple of cases where the two things can kind of go together. So the issue of the campaign in the Philippines is interesting because all of the money, additional revenue that was raised through sin taxes and increasing tax rates on alcohol and tobacco consumption, which one could argue by itself can have let's say a negative distributional impact because of its regressive nature, was actually transformed. So a lot of additional revenue was created through this reform, which goes to speaks to your point. And all of that money was earmarked for increasing the coverage of universal health insurance. So there was, again, as Chiara was saying, linking the revenue and the expenditure side, taking into account both the revenue mobilization effort and the financing of basic services on the expenditure side was something that interestingly combines equity considerations with, let's say, increasing revenue mobilization efforts. In Mexico, the issue of tackling the campaign from Fundar was able to eventually convince the government to eliminate tax amnesties as a fiscal policy tool, which clearly has, again, a double effect, a positive one on revenue mobilization because the government stops sort of forgiving these tax debts, these tax liabilities that citizens and corporations have. And on the other hand, it also had a positive equity impact because of the regressive nature of these tax amnesties that were benefiting actors that did not need these additional revenues. In some of the other cases, the revenue mobilization side of things was not that evident. In Uganda, data on these 2 additional taxes that were introduced was not very clear in terms of its impact. In Guatemala, the reform was more about tax administration. But I think Mexico and the Philippines are very interesting in terms of showing these the trade-offs between the need for governments to raise additional revenue and the distributional impact of how this is done. So at the end of the day, there's clearly, if we talk about the DRM agenda, if we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and what governments need to do to sort of make the best effort at trying to achieve as many of them as possible by 2030 and so on, there's clearly, let's say, a domestic resource mobilization imperative. But what cannot be forgotten is that any new tax that is introduced will have a distributional impact. And what is important is to basically take that into account and make sure that whatever additional revenue is collected is collected in a way that, on one hand, sort of does not make inequality worse, and if possible, it actually improves levels of equity and sort of reduces inequality as a result. So taking the two things together, I think, is what we were trying to look at here.
Thank you, Paulo. The Philippines case is interesting because what they agreed was on soft earmarking. In other words, they agreed to raise the spending on health concurrently with increased taxation on tobacco. It was not hard earmarking. So that is an important distinction to bear in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So let me turn to Nabil again. And by the way, anybody who wants to intervene in response to some of the comments made by other panelists, please raise your hand and I will allow for a discussion to take place. Anything that you disagree with that would make the discussion more stimulating. Nabil, you've been described in your initial remarks how Oxfam has been engaged. And I remember I used to look through all the reports that Oxfam produces on income distribution. So what have you learned from your experience so far in your campaigns, and what could inform your future strategies in this area? Has your experience been successful? I mean, you've been highlighting some of these concerns, and the reports have provided a lot of interesting facts. What have you learned so far that can help you in the future?
It's a wonderful question, Sanjeev. One of my colleagues was just remarking recently that it's just as well we're not on performance-related pay here at Oxfam, because with inequality continuing to be so extreme and widening in so many cases, we'd be we'd be pretty much out of a job or soon. But let me just answer your question in a sec. But just before I do that, I wanted to just reflect on something that's been said a couple of times. We hear about civil society as, and I respectfully, about brokers, about partners, and that is definitely true. But I want to make sure that we're clear as well about civil society's political role in holding governments at all levels to account, the importance of shoring up their civic space. This work can get messy, it's challenging, and it gets opposition as well from governments. And we should always remind ourselves of that important role that civil society plays. Now, in response to your question, three reflections, if I may. Number one is a learning is to be clear-sighted about the opposition, right, to progressive taxation. And this speaks to the fact that this is a political exercise. There are winners from this system of very regressive taxation, from a collapse on taxation, be it, for example, the richest people in corporations. In the US alone, by the way, with recent data shows about $4 billion about a year goes into lobbying Congress from corporations. Years ago, Oxfam estimated that for every dollar that corporations spent lobbying on tax issues, they received an estimated $1,200 in tax breaks. So that's quite some rate of return. We also, many of us felt under siege, for example, in 2021, when there were progressive tax proposals on the table, but to see this lobbying blitz come to stop Congress from passing and advancing President Biden's economic agenda, which included progressive tax proposals. There's also opposition in terms of richer countries. Darajee spoke very clearly about this, protecting their interests at the international level. This is why the arrival of a multipolar world is so critical to conversations on inequality, but also common conversations on economic decolonization. And let's be frank here to say that there's also been opposition from the international financial institutions, from the IMF and the World Bank, relying excessively on regressive taxation that we've seen in recent decades, that I think, as we've all seen, it puts more of a burden on a woman, selling fruit by the side of the road who lives in poverty than it does on the 1% at the top. It's positive to see renewed attention, for example, on the importance of progressive taxation in the messaging of the IFIs, but it's time that we see this actually translated seriously into policy. And it shouldn't surprise us that income inequality is either high or rising in 60% of countries that have loans from the IMF and the World Bank. So we have to be clear there. So the opposition in terms of that political opposition, but let me just spend a moment to say we need to be clear-sighted about the opposition in terms of ideas, in terms of the terms of debate, in terms of narratives. And Paula's, your books speak so profoundly to this as well. And what are some examples of those? And this is what we confront. Exact ideas, for example, on trickle down. I think sometimes there's a comfort in our spaces that these narratives have been demolished, but they remain strong, and we must push back against them. The idea that tax cuts for the very richest at the corporations at the top trickle down to everybody else. This has been disproven time and time again. There's been some really phenomenal research that's come out as well, again, in recent years, just to show how untrue this is. It showed, how the incomes of the richest actually grew much faster in countries where tax rates were lowered, and instead of trickling down to the ordinary people, they simply did not. They simply just redistributed wealth upwards. And we know what the actual drivers of economic growth were, be it stronger labor protections and wages and rights, or access to high quality education, health for all, good public infrastructure. Other examples we know of narratives that matter to this work is, taxes, for example. It's a very technical, it's a very bureaucratic issue. It's devoid of politics, We know that, again, that's not the case. It's fundamentally a political exercise. And I think it's important to underline that once we sacrifice the terrain of the political, a technical space leaves very little room to maneuver. So it's important that we address that. Another one that we hear is that, the super rich actually should basically get to decide how much they're being taxed. And this comes up in debate time and time again. It comes up in subtle ways. It continuously plays out. Actually, we should say it's a decision that should be left to our democracies, to people to make. And probably my favorite, if I could use that term, narrative that we have to, often push it back against is that it just can't be done. It's just not possible to be done. And there are so many ways to take this on. Present day examples of countries who are doing the right thing. Oxfam produces, for example, something called the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index. Its next edition is out in October, and we serve as examples of governments making the right choices. But there's also the historical ones, and Darjay, again, you spoke to this, and this is so important. Be the example of, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt here in the United States, who rewrote the rules of the American economy in the wake of World War II, for example. People get shocked by this very example, going to Congress, urging 100% tax rate at the top for the very top earners on income above what would be about $1 million today. They settled and negotiated on getting it to 94%, and it averaged 81% until 1981 over a 30-year period, in a period in which the US, grew its middle class, put a man on the moon. So examples like this, examples as well, I think even at least some people have heard of this example. There's so many examples that we need to surface and remind ourselves, even from the global South. I've been studying, for example, the example of Zambia, in post-liberation years, doing more to claw back the revenues for its natural resources and investing them back into ordinary people. These stories have been not unintentionally, but I think conveniently forgotten. And I think it's important that we grapple with these narratives. And this is why it's important to shift narrative as much as it is to shift policy. And the two absolutely go hand in hand. A very final point, Sanjeev, if you allow me, is that, Paulo, your book talks about, and I quote, long-term investment in civic movement building is essential for achieving long-term goals. And I think that's so important. There's something to be said here about strategic patience, looking at the arc, not just the moment. And going to the example of the global corporate tax deal, which was once called, not long ago, just over a decade now, impossible, idealistic, will never happen. It's just agitation. And, we got there far from what was needed, let's be clear, but a notable step to show that it's possible. Yes, so much more needs to be done and so much better. And that effort, we're still in the strategic arc. We're still moving in that direction. And in fact, the phenomenal efforts done by the Africa group of nations, by civil society, particularly tax justice movements across the world, have moved us in the right direction and are continuing to move us. In fact, the UN tax negotiations are taking place on the convention today. And it's a kind of an opportune moment for us to be talking about this, to show that it's not a moment, but it's an arc, and we need to keep our eye on that longer term goal.
Thank you, Nabil. We are left with roughly 10 minutes. So I'm going to limit the responses now to about 2 minutes so that we can complete this round. And should also give me about a minute to summarize some of the key points that have come up during the discussion. So we have one question which has come up from the audience, which, Darjay, you may have seen it, but essentially the question is for you. And the question is asking, if you're taxing and you tax too much, how do you create incentives for the private sector to conduct business? So basically, how do you balance the taxation of businesses against the businesses to function in a way that they can create incomes and jobs? Just 2 minutes, please, Derje. You are muted. You are muted.
Sorry, 2 minutes is too short because I had also some observations about the discussion so far. It is about winning the narrative and winning the political struggle. These are two different things. Exposing how this economy works and how disadvantaged it is to working people, to developing countries is really an easy task. To give you an example, to show the economic structure which really facilitates tax dodging, illicit financial flows, there are two examples I always give. Why do you think that there is one company registered per inhabitant in the British Virgin Islands? Why do you think the Isle of Jersey, between France and England, is a major exporter of bananas to the rest of Europe? By answering these questions, you can show the structures taking place, the structures that facilitate this, and there are vested interests. There are political powers which are supporting this mechanism. In the negotiations, you see, for example, when countries decide to tax digital profits generated without having a physical presence generated in an economy, those with the multinational, where the multinationals are domiciled, like the USA, will go to these countries. If you introduce digital service tax, we'll do this and that to you. So you see that it is about relation of force. It is no more about winning the arguments. Coming to this question, I think if a company is interested in long-term benefits for itself, it has also to be interested that it has to share in the cost of educating the society that produces the labor force for itself, in the cost of keeping the environment habitable for a long term, so that a long-term benefit also is possible for this. So to put it only lowering taxes bring investors into a country is a false narrative. Actually, I am very polemical on this. Those who want to invest and make profit without paying taxes are not investors but scavengers, because it has to be in the long-term interest of business to pay due taxes instead of using multiple mechanisms to avoid taxes, so that they continue. Who takes care of health? Are not investors interested in an educated workforce? Are they not interested in healthy workforce? From where does the money come to keep society in such a situation, healthy, educated, and all amenities that investors need? That is generated through taxes. If those who have more are not paying more, where does society get the money to provide these services? So it is, for real investors, it is not an issue. It is not a dilemma. But for scavengers, it is, because it is about extracting and destroying and leaving destruction in your wake. It is not about generating wealth which benefits every participant in the process. So it is a false dilemma. Companies can pay due taxes and then at the same time get their profits and enable society also to profit from their investment.
Thank you, Derje. Let me turn to Jera now. Jera, I mean, you've seen the 7 case studies in the book. What lessons do you draw for the bank from those case studies, which bank can take into account in its operations with the countries?
They're all very interesting examples. I'd say one thing was, there are different, I think the framework is interesting. So one is I think we agree that country context matters. Also, the report or the book takes into consideration the stakeholders. So it's important to take a stakeholder analysis because, as the book is showing, you want to engage with legislators, you want to engage with business groups, in addition to the judiciary, and in addition to a broader civil society or research group. So those are which I would call stakeholders. And that's something that the bank does when we have enough resources for analytical work, because it's essential. And I think what the book is telling us is that, which also resonates, and we started a new program on coalition for reforms, not only on tax reforms, but I think what emerges from the book, which is very interesting, is that these reforms are very political, as we heard from my peers here. And so it does require a broad consensus, basically, whether to go against a certain reform or whether to support a reform. And I just want to make one point, which is the following. My team is spending a lot of resources and time on measuring institutional capacity, and we're trying also to be more specific on in the fiscal space and in the tax policy and tax administration. And why is that? How we measure them, and to be able to be more specific on what is then the quality of these institutions, what is their impact on the more economic development. And I see two areas. One is that recently Ernst & Young has issued a paper on the shadow economy and what are the factors of the causality of certain factors that have an impact, negative impact on shadow, so reducing shadow economy. And what emerges from the report is that why for high income countries, taxation is the main the fluctuation of taxation is the main factor for increasing or decreasing shadow economy. Actually, for low-income countries, it's a lot about institutional capacity at large, so not taxes so much. And that's why we want to really understand the institutional dimensions. And I think it's important to keep it in mind, and it links a little bit with what I was saying before. You need to build trust, you need to build systems that also give assurance that resources are being well spent. And so I think this is an important factor. The other one is that in our studies from our poverty teams that are looking at what are the patterns of consumptions for low-income groups, so citizens that are below or households that are below the poverty line, actually they're really, we find that they're not impacted. So they are basically in the gray economy because they are relying on barter. And so this is also very important when we think about policy or tax policy reforms or fiscal reforms, how that impacts the poorest. And all this to say that I think you asked me what I think about the book. I think there are many dimensions that need to come together. But I'm glad that Paolo is looking also at what is the role of civil society, because I see them very part of the coalition for reform dimensions. And so they are a very important part of this coalition.
Thank you.
I stop here.
Thank you. Paulo, we have 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask you a very ambitious question, but I'll let you decide how far you want to go. So in the book, you suggest that civil actors have responded reactively to government proposals. Should civil actors be more proactive in influencing not only taxation but also expenditure policies?
Thank you, Sanjeev. I mean, of course they do. I think it's actually not the book itself, but I think in the book we say that the literature to date shows that civil society involvement with tax reforms and tax policies has mostly been a reactive one. But certainly our cases show very much a mixture of reacting to tax policy proposals that civic actors didn't like or thought were regressive and were fighting against, but also a number of cases where they were actually the campaign initiators, the coalition formers, and the ones that were advocating for tax policy changes. That's certainly the case again in the Philippines, in Mexico, in the US in a number of ways, in Guatemala as well. But we also do some cases of a more reactive stance. I think, to sort of try and answer your question, is that a reactive stance, of course, is easier because all you have to do is wait for something to happen in terms of the government trying to introduce something and then react to it. And reactions can generate momentum because of this opposition. While for a proactive stance, you actually need your background, technical, analytical skills. You need to work on the coalition building. You need to basically do a lot of homework and more time to basically build up your case and craft a narrative and so on and so forth along the different emerging themes that I spoke about. And while on the expenditure side of things, I think civil society has already accumulated, substantive experience making the case for the need for finance and basic services, making the case for a number of other areas of spending that are quite important across countries. On the taxation side, I think civil society is still lagging behind, is still basically trying to catch up, is still fighting against very powerful forces like, Nabil and Dereje very, very nicely sort of laid out. The fact that the opposition against progressive tax reforms is very powerful, is very concentrated, has lots of means. So civic actors find themselves often at a disadvantage when they're trying to adopt a proactive stance. And they often get shut out, with the excuse that these are very technical matters that civil society is not really capable of tackling. But I think it is not only important, it is actually necessary for civic actors across different countries and at the international level to adopt a more proactive stance in producing analyses, in crafting narratives, in trying to take center stage in the battle for ideas, which will then, hopefully generate more and more across different contexts, political momentum for some of these more reforms that are aimed at making tax systems more equitable and overcoming the opposition to these reforms. So proactivism, let's call it that, is not only important, but also necessary in my view. And we hope that through some of these cases, we've shown how this can be done or has been done in some cases, and that others can learn from these cases to sort of try and adapt and adopt some of these lessons into other contexts.
Thank you, Paulo. Let me just summarize in a minute or two some of the key points that have emerged. And of course, progressive taxation is a way to make the tax system more equitable. And within that, there is also need for taxation of capital income, which Nabil did not discuss, but I think that, for example, taxation of interest and dividend income, which is taxed at low levels in most countries. And but then going back to what Paulo said, we need to bring in the civil society in this area to be able to forcefully argue in the context of the budget discussions, in the context of the other discussions on economic policy that are happening within the countries. The international taxation remains an important issue, but it's not going to yield that much revenues to be able to fund the SDGs or fund the climate transition. But it's important for equity and other reasons, and I totally agree with Dirje on that issue. And we need to understand the political economy of the reforms, tax reforms, because I don't think we fully understand how this works. And once the civil actors are able to join that political process, then they may have an entry point to be able to influence the taxation decisions. And I think it's good to see that international institutions are also engaged in discussions. And I think that's a positive development. So I think with this, I will conclude and thank all the panelists for joining the discussion and taking the time to participate in this book launch. Thank you, Paulo, for requesting us to do it. And thank you so much. We are still 5 minutes over time, but I think it was worth it. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Thank you.